Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to this public lecture. My name's Rebecca Bunting, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Bedfordshire, and I'm delighted to introduce my guest this evening, Professor Sir Van-Tam, a very well-known name to most of us. Because of unforeseen circumstances, we've had to take this fully online instead of a hybrid on-campus, not on-campus meeting. So I'm very grateful to everyone for the arrangements they've made about that, and also to you for your understanding. It is a privilege to welcome tonight's speaker. Professor Van-Tam visited the university in 2019 when he delivered a public lecture presciently entitled Thinking the Unthinkable, Influenza Pandemic Preparedness and Response. Little did we know at that time that the outbreak of COVID-19 was on the horizon and would have such an impact on our lives. So we are delighted that he's able to join us now, to come back this evening and to deliver what could be considered to be a follow-up to that very lecture. Tonight's lecture, Reflections on Leading Through the COVID-19 Pandemic, will explore the main ways in which we have begun to control the virus and limit its consequences. And it will reflect on some of the major decision-making and leadership challenges that have presented themselves during the pandemic. Professor Van-Tam is a public health specialist with an extensive background in respiratory virus pandemics and emergency medicine. He is one of the UK's most esteemed and respected public health experts. In 2017, he joined the Department of Health and Social Care as Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and it was in this role that he became a familiar face on our television screens, as he somewhat reluctantly acquired public recognition, playing a crucial part in the UK's response to the pandemic, particularly in relation to the acquisition and rollout of vaccines. His direct, no-nonsense style of communication on the podium at number 10 Downing Street, along with his use of colourful metaphors to deliver complicated scientific concepts in ways that we could understand, has been widely praised and respected by the British public. I'm sure many of you here this evening can remember some of those metaphors about football and trains and so on, and you may have some questions about those to ask him. Before this role placed him in the spotlight, Professor Van-Tam trained as a physician in Nottingham and has worked in many varied and interesting fields, including as medical officer to the Lincolnshire Army Cadet Force and as a consultant on influenza to both the World Health Organization and the UK Health Protection Agency. Most recently, he has taken up the post of Faculty Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of Nottingham after stepping down as Deputy Chief Medical Officer earlier this year. His extensive career has been widely recognised and awarded. He was made an MBE in the 1998 honours and received a knighthood this year in the New Year's honours for his service to public health. Professor Van-Tam is happy to take questions after the lecture, and we would encourage you to ask questions if you have any. Please make use of the comments function so that you can submit those. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Professor Sir Van-Tam MBE.
Good evening, Vice-Chancellor. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all to guests online for joining. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I think the news is broken and you understand the circumstances, but I'm nevertheless very happy to give this lecture, even if I might cough once or twice during it, for which you'll have to forgive me. So what I'm going to do in the next 50 minutes or so is really take you on a whistle-stop tour that delves into my reflections on what has happened to us all in the last 2.5 years and some of the leadership angles arising from that I'll share with you. So first of all, it is indeed a pleasure to return to the University of Bedfordshire, and the Vice-Chancellor has quite rightly reminded you all that the last lecture I gave here was about pandemics, and funnily enough, this one is reflecting on what we've just been through. In that interim, it's been the largest and arguably the worst global public health event of a lifetime. And before I go further into the slides, I want to remind everyone that, as is well known in government circles, the views expressed are my own and not necessarily those of the Department of Health and Social Care or the UK government. So the first thing to say, I think, where I want to begin, is to say that we've got enough data now to look back on this pandemic event and say it has been a big one. Many countries have struggled to officially report COVID deaths due to a lack of diagnostics, and in some cases even a lack of hospital care, and a lack of access to healthcare to even be diagnosed. But the latest WHO data suggests that the excess deaths during the pandemic period have been around 15 million, 3 times as many as those that have been recorded officially in statistics around the world. And that a quite big burden of that total mortality has actually fallen in the lower and middle income countries of the world, even though their recording systems for COVID deaths have perhaps fallen short in some cases of capturing the full burden. And this then takes me back to the coronavirus itself and the fact that for many years influenza pandemics had been recognized as a threat. There'd been a lot of preparedness work towards influenza pandemics, but we had a novel coronavirus that had crossed from a natural host via an intermediate host and given us the SARS-CoV-1, the original SARS outbreaks in 2003. We then saw another novel coronavirus cross from animals into humans in 2013, and indeed that MERS problem is still ongoing at a low level in the Arabian Peninsula. And then finally we've had this rather big event, again related to a novel coronavirus. And for me, that brings me to, I think, my kind of reflection or lesson number one, that in the future, we really are going to have to prepare for pandemic threats more widely and beyond influenza, even though I believe that is still the number one future threat. We're going to have to build systems of management and control that are that bit more multi-pathogen capable. And given what we've seen in terms of the kind of geopolitical shocks and pressures caused by this pandemic, I think we're going to have to start to think about how we can build meaningful international preparedness that can actually withstand those geopolitical pressures a bit better than has been the case this time around. So dropping back into history a little bit now, the last really severe pandemic was indeed influenza, and it was in 1918, the last severe one. 3 epidemic waves in close succession, 20 to 40 million deaths worldwide, 198,000 excess civilian deaths in Britain, and a larger number, obviously, in the US. This is rather similar to the kind of experience we've had in the last couple of years, 3 epidemic waves in close succession. And for comparison, between early 2020 and mid-2021, the excess deaths in England and Wales this time have been 98,000. So you could argue that mid-2021 was only a midpoint of the pandemic. And so you can see that what we've just been through, what we're living through the tail end of, has actually been quite a seismic event in terms of its kind of public health impact and its size. Now here's a slide that you will have seen before or seen something similar before from the government press conferences. And it shows how SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, takes a grip in our society. And these data are from autumn 2020, and they're from Nottinghamshire, just as an example. And you can see on the left of the slide, that's early October, and on the right of the slide, that's 3 weeks later. And you can see that the age bands go from the bottom of the slide to the top to 60 plus. And you can see that very rapidly the 16 to 29 case rate heats up, and then over a period of no more than a week or two, it starts to creep into that next age group up, the 30 to 44s. We tend to interact with people of our own age or people just above or just below our age. So that's why it creeps up there. And then once it's in the 30 to 44s and it's heating up, it then a couple of weeks later creeps up into the 45s to 59s, and then eventually into the elderly. And that is the typical pattern that we have been observing with COVID-19. But the pattern of mortality, excuse me, is rather different. You can see from this slide, whether you look at males on the left or females on the right, you can see that essentially the death signal, the mortality signal, really begins to pick up above the age of 50. And it just gets larger and larger with increasing age. And although there are many other risk factors for having a bad outcome due to SARS-CoV-2, the biggest one was always age, every single time. And you can see this too in this slide in terms of the hospitalization data. Now, for the time being, I don't want you to look at the differences between vaccinated and unvaccinated. Just look at the unvaccinated bars, the dark blue bars. And you can see in that population, the hospitalization rate increasing with age, but particularly picking up again after the age of 50. And this slide, which is work by John Burns-Murdoch, but using official UK government data, really shows the summation of what I've been saying to you. That if you start on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see compared with seasonal flu, in the younger ages, COVID-19 has not been more lethal than seasonal flu. But the moment you've hit about 30 years of age, it's become 3 times as lethal and got worse with increasing age, to the point where beyond the age of 60, the lethality of COVID-19 in mid-2020, this is pre-vaccination, was 13-fold higher than that for seasonal flu. So it was really quite a quantum difference in severity that we were having to deal with. And so really, to summarize the kind of unconstrained impact of COVID-19, a very high mortality burden in the over 50s, a very high hospitalization burden, mainly but not exclusively in the over 50s, and really quite higher than normal clinical severity in the over 30s. And that's what we've been dealing with. And so I think another reflection for the future is that we should not pretend that these high severity events aren't going to happen. We've been here before, and we will certainly go there again in the foreseeable future. And I'll come back to that in the questions, I'm sure. Now, I'm going to move on now to diagnostics. And here is a slide that shows you the 3 epidemic waves in the UK using official data and using cases as diagnosed. And you can see with the eye of faith, just about, you can see wave 1. You could then see wave 2 rather more clearly. And on the right, you can see wave 3 very clearly indeed. These are not rates, they're just cases by specimen date. And I put a red box around wave 1 just to make sure you can see it, because it's so small to see. But it's not really small. If you look at the same data now in terms of hospitalizations, you can see that wave 1 is very much bigger indeed. And this reflects the reality of where we were at the beginning of the pandemic, that we didn't have enough diagnostic tests to pick up those cases in the community. And so where we found them was in the hospitalizations, because that's where the very limited diagnostics had to be focused on patients who were seriously ill. And when you look at it this way, the size of the first, the second and the third waves are rather more comparable. And the point I want to make is about diagnostics that we are going to continue to need them at a certain critical scale to predict what's going on, to monitor threats and trends. And there is a bit of a question about how much diagnostics and for how long. But I'm very clear in my own mind that whilst I understand that countries around the world can't provide free access to testing for COVID-19 forever, we have to have some baseline of testing. If we don't, we are going to risk sleepwalking into future problems. And particularly, I'm nervous about the variant question, which I don't think is settled yet. And whatever diagnostic capacity we retain, we have to have the ability to scale it up again rapidly in case we need it again in the future. Now I'm going to turn to science knowledge, and I'm going to put it to you that we've lived through 3 phases of science knowledge. In the blue, first, a period where we had very little information on the virus, mainly coming from countries with those early waves. And what we did in terms of the policy and the clinical response was based on first principles for respiratory viruses generally. It was based on modelling, but with pretty wide confidence intervals because of the limited data and very limited testing. Then we moved into era number 2, where we started to get lots of observational, clinical and epidemiological data for ourselves, coupled with widespread testing. And we were then in a better position to start to target some of our responses and to think about some of the newer tools, for example, something we've never used in the UK to any great extent before, face coverings. And we began to be able to repurpose existing tools, drugs, for example, dexamethasone, the steroid that was an early discovery. And then the final era we're now in is where we're getting specific COVID tools. Firstly, the vaccines, but also now a number of specific anti-coronavirus drugs that are becoming available. So they're the kind of eras of knowledge that I think we've worked through. And in terms of public health policy, that has transitioned with the knowledge that we've had over time. So if you start at the top of this slide, when we had limited or scarce data, very low public health and clinical certainty about anything, no specific treatments, or certainly nothing proven, vaccines potentially years away. We didn't know how quick we could get vaccines. That was at the same time as we had this very high public imperative to stop or delay spread at all costs to avoid health service overwhelm. And all we had at that point to throw at this was social interventions, social distancing, lockdowns, all the things that you and I have lived through together. But gradually, the emphasis on social interventions has declined, and the emphasis on clinical interventions has increased. We've got more data. We've been able to modify the disease course with early adoption of treatments. Then we've had specific antivirals, and we now have a mature vaccine program. Our health service remains under pressure, but is not overwhelmed. Mortality is reduced, and we're getting to the point where we have to live with COVID-19 in something of a more kind of endemic or at least recurrent epidemic state. And this is a slide, unashamedly borrowed from Professor Sir Chris Whitty. And he makes the point that actually many of the tools we used early on were very well established. Quarantine, closing high-risk occupations, self-isolation of the sick. And if you go back in the historical writings, these predate the kind of germ theory, the idea that organisms caused infectious diseases. The historical writings go much, much further back than that and show that this is what human populations did to slow down the spread of disease. But the new science has allowed us perhaps to target them better as the data has improved. And gradually we've begun to de-link being a case from somebody who's hospitalized or who's at risk of dying from COVID-19. And Chris argues that that isn't something new, and he's quite right. We have seen exactly that with HIV and with Ebola. And it is, we're really just going through, we've been through the same patterns that in the kind of evolution of how we move from the social to the specific as time progresses with a new organism. And let's talk a bit more about those social interventions, which have been very painful and very difficult. Now, the three things that normally one has to keep in balance, to keep a balanced scorecard for these kind of public health interventions, is first to say, how difficult are they to put in place? What does it cost to put them in place? Will there be support of the population to put them in place? And how long will we have to have them in place for? The difficulty of the intervention. The next thing is, what is the size of the effect you might get back? And what is the strength of the evidence that you will get an effect back? And into that mix, I think, has been thrown an additional dimension in the COVID-19 pandemic, one that's perhaps a bit more political, and that is, what is the potential risk of doing nothing? And for all of these social interventions, they've all been, with the greatest sympathy to ministers, extremely difficult decisions from the word go. I don't need to describe them to you, you know them already, but they've been blunt tools. They've caused collateral damage in terms of economic well-being, social well-being, educational and psychological, and therefore they've been really exceptionally difficult political choices. Now, political leaders, thankfully, not government advisors, have to integrate and make those major decisions. And it's always been this balance between two very unpalatable options. And even the kind of narrow public health outcomes have had difficulties associated with them. And the SAGE system, which you heard about, was a system that attempted to provide a central scientific view on what the evidence was, but also with the uncertainty around that evidence very clearly laid out. And we had to make very clear that the science could change and COVID, the virus, could evolve over time. And of course, in a democracy, there are always perfectly respectable scientific outlying views, both on the side of do more and on the side of do less. And it's absolutely right that those views should be heard. But what SAGE always tried to do was to try and lay out that uncertainty and arrive at a consensus in the middle. And one of the things that I think also emerged was that arriving at a consensus is easier within a discipline than between disciplines. And that was always very tricky to handle. And that's why SAGE had such a multidisciplinary makeup. The other thing that's new that we didn't have really in the last pandemic, the swine flu pandemic of 2009, was the era of the preprint server, where scientists can put their early work without peer review onto a server that makes it publicly available to others. Now, that has many advantages, that it gives people the data very quickly, but it has many disadvantages in that at that point, the work is not peer reviewed and it may be incorrect. And so there are strengths and weaknesses to what has happened with the preprints. And the government has had to make decisions not following national guidelines, practice, formal synthesis, but had to make decisions much quicker and at much greater speed because of the emergency, and more centrally for fairness. But that also carries risks when you make decisions at speed. So I reflect on three lessons here, really. First, that making urgent strategic decisions based on highly imperfect information is really challenging. And what is possibly more challenging is communicating scientific uncertainty to policymakers. And again, equally important and equally challenging is communicating to the public that as scientists, there are points when we are uncertain about things, and there is a range of uncertainty within which we have to work. Following on from our use of social interventions and many countries around the world, I think there needs to be greater cross-government familiarity with the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions, and a deeper understanding of, first of all, the impact they have, and secondly, the tolerance of the public. And we're going to have to get better at synthesizing interdisciplinary science in the future. Now, one of the things that I've definitely been involved in, and I think the thing that I'm proudest about being involved in, was the vaccine task force. And here are some of the principles that kind of underpinned the vaccine task force. First of all, it was activated very early, and we had a single mission: get vaccines for the UK and then the world as quickly as possible. We could pick our own team. We could pick our own range of specialists. We were allowed to take considerable calculated risks. And from the outset, it was very much in the open that we would need to be willing to take losses in order to succeed. We kind of went to the stores and drew our own kit. We said what we wanted. We spent our own budget within appropriate ministerial oversight, and we were allowed to do whatever it took to complete the mission. So that's a bit general. What does it mean in practice? It meant that we could go to the private sector, to the clinical sector, to the industrial scientists, to the commercial, the project management, and of course into government to pick exactly who we wanted. It meant we had a ring-fenced budget, and it meant we could take a portfolio approach, which effectively is scientific spread betting on a whole range of different vaccine types, in the hope that some of them would come through quickly. And indeed they did. And instead of treating ourselves as the customer and the vaccine industry as the producer, we actually said, look, this is not a situation for these kind of dividing lines. We have to be in partnership with you and solve your problems as you go along. And we have to solve our own problems in terms of our ability to manufacture vaccines in the UK as we go along. And we got 500,000 people to sign up and say, if there's a vaccine study and I'm eligible, then I will take part and I will help you. And we deliberately funded the studies at speed that we knew we needed to do. So it was spread betting with a bit of fortune thrown in as much that the messenger RNA technology was ready, it was maturing, and I don't think it would have been there if this had all happened 5 years previously. I'm going to turn now to JCVI and make a kind of shout out for them, because they took some incredibly difficult, skilled decisions early on. Basically, in the beginning, nobody had enough vaccine and everybody had to start somewhere. And it was these kind of data that helped JCVI decide where to start. Very quickly, if you look at the top row here, these are care home residents. And basically, if you look to the right column, the number needed to vaccinate, NNV, you need to vaccinate 20 people in a care home to save one life. If you go down to people over 70 years of age, it's 600 people that you need to vaccinate to save one life. It's still very, very efficient, but the number is getting larger. And there's quite a cliff edge below the age of 50, where it goes from 8,000 or so to 47,000 below the age of 50. So I'm just kind of showing you those data so you can understand that there was a very rational decision to start where JCVI did. And the next thing JCVI did in company with the chief medical officers, was to say, look, the volume of vaccine we've got initially is limited. And if we extend the interval so that it's no longer 3 to 4 weeks as recommended by the manufacturers, but make it 12 weeks, we can actually give twice as many people partial protection in that period. It's rather simple maths. Half as many people get 2 doses, or twice as many people get 1 dose. It was very controversial, and there was a lot of criticism, quite often from patients who'd had their first dose and wanted their second before anybody else had a first. Also from the British Medical Association and the World Health Organization, and all of them were proven to be wrong. And here's why they were proven to be wrong. If you look at the point estimates here in this big red box, these are the estimated hazard ratios, and the lower the hazard ratio towards the bottom of the slide, the higher the vaccine effectiveness. You can see that for an interval of 14 to 20 or 21 to 27 days, the hazard ratios are in the region of 0.6. If you leave that interval to 56 to 81 days, much closer to our 12-week interval, the hazard ratios drop right down here, and you're getting much, much higher vaccine effectiveness. So JCVI took the right decision against really an onslaught of criticism at the time. And we know again that it was a very hard decision when the AstraZeneca vaccine was limited to people initially over the age of 30 and then over the age of 40. But these are the kind of data that help JCVI make a rational decision. They look, for example, at the potential harms from the AZ vaccine on this side versus the potential benefits in terms of ICU admissions prevented on this side. And you can see that 0.2 versus 14, 0.5 versus 5, these are still very big numbers in favour of vaccination, but they do become more nuanced down in the 20 to 29 age group. And that explains why JCVI took the kind of decisions it did. Now, unfortunately, the slide I wanted to show you has not worked on the presenter that we're using, so I'll just have to skip it, unfortunately, and show you the effect of vaccinations in another way. So on this slide, which starts in December 2020 over here and runs to September 2021 on the right, you can see, first of all, a blue line, and that is the modelled hospitalizations. And you can see this peak in the early part of 2021 and another big modelled peak in the latter part of 2021 in the autumn. But the brown line is actually the observed hospitalizations. And you can see at the beginning, when the vaccine program had hardly got going, there was a very close match between the expected hospitalizations and what was actually observed. If you look to the right of the slide, the observed line is tiny compared to the expected. And that was the real power and the difference of the vaccination program as it got going. But on vaccines, I want to make another point, and that is that if you look at these data in the red box, these are just for the Pfizer vaccine after 2 doses, and therefore the alpha variant. You can see that the protection against infection is lowest at 70 to 90%. The protection against infection with symptoms, symptomatic disease, is a little bit higher, and the protection against hospitalization and mortality is very high. Let's move now to the Omicron era. And here, if you look in the purple box, you can see the effect of 3 doses. And you can see that the protection against infection in those purple boxes is quite strong, 2 to 4 weeks after 3 doses. But it gets weaker and weaker by 10 weeks plus. But on the right in the red box, after 3 doses, as opposed to after 2, the hold up against hospitalization is really quite strong. And so if you put these data together, you get a picture that vaccines are preventing serious disease, but they're not preventing infection as well. And here's further kind of evidence. I've showed you this slide already. If you now look at the hospitalization rates for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated in the pre-Omicron era, yes, it increases by age, but at every age group, the difference between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated is really very stark indeed. And if you look at this slide, which is the critical care ICU admissions data, then on the left you've got young age groups, and on the right you've got 70 plus. But the only columns you can see are the blue columns. The other columns, which represent 1, 2, or 3 doses of vaccine, are hardly visible. And what this slide really tells you is that 1 dose of vaccine is having a very sizable effect in preventing the possibility of intensive care admission at every age, which again I think tells its own story. So to summarize, we are living with this virus now because of the effectiveness of mass vaccination. We've lowered the disease pyramid for SARS-CoV-2. We've got more of that infection below the hospital waterline. But the vaccines we've got, we have to face facts, are disease modifying rather than offering full disease and transmission prevention. And we are seeing that these vaccines wane over time, which is why boosters are being required. And we remain at the moment at risk from a new variant that might actually be vaccine escaping. So it isn't a time to relax, but it's certainly a time to celebrate where we've got to. And the biggest lesson for me, and it kind of relates to one of the questions I think that's been asked, is every time when we have these kind of new problems, the thing to do is get on the front foot really early with vaccine development. And I think lots of countries around the world are looking and saying, do we need better onshored underlying vaccine manufacturing infrastructure? So here's that slide again of mid-2020. Just to remind you again, the mortality experience of COVID compared with flu is very much higher after the age of 30. Now that's mid-2020. The same scientist has used the same data, but this time early 2022. And you can see that there is much, much less difference between the seasonal flu line in blue and the COVID-19 line in red. Granted, COVID is still twice as lethal above the age of 60 than seasonal flu, but below the age of 60, it's a bit more of a nuanced and I would argue essentially similar picture. And that's how we've transformed the disease, mainly with vaccines. But of course, overlaid on this diagram is the fact that we're now dealing with the Omicron variant, which we know is much milder than the original Wuhan wild type variant. So let's now look at vaccine uptake, and there's lots and lots of curves on here. But the only one I want you to look at is the over 80s over here, this first left-hand purple line. And I want you to look at the steepness of that acceleration from 0% uptake to 95% uptake. It was absolutely dramatic for that first dose of vaccine. Now let's look at the same age group in terms of the speed of uptake for the third booster dose. You can see it's much more gradual and it doesn't attain quite the same final height. And that pattern is mirrored in every age group, with reducing enthusiasm for vaccine as you go down the younger ages. And the thing I want to kind of say on that one is that even in a severe pandemic, vaccine acceptance and uptake are both incomplete. And we just have to live with that. And vaccine fatigue and lack of urgency are live future issues. Now I say, and I'm right in saying, that boosters are very important, but they are actually less important than primary immunization in terms of the gain you get. And so the public are being kind of scientifically irrational if they don't come for their booster, but they're being scientifically rational in as much that the primary immunization course was the most important. Our biggest problem now is how long these vaccines last and how many more variants they can hold out against. And so this durability of protection is something that scientists and manufacturers will have to work on. And how we return to a business as usual market for vaccines, COVID vaccines, is really a big future challenge that no one's got any answers to yet. Touching finally on some research, I could say it really in one sentence that the UK punched well above its weight in terms of pandemic research. Research funding was directive and quick. Testing was very rapid. Clinical trials started almost immediately, and we resisted in the UK very efficiently. We resisted across the NHS pressure to deploy drugs that people said worked in other parts of the world, but where we didn't have the trial evidence. We'd also been putting a lot of money into vaccine research in the post-Ebola era, and that definitely helped. For example, the startup of the successful AZ vaccine. And we put a huge amount of effort and emphasis on research that would give us immediate policy answers. And the little graph on the right shows you that from March 2020 to March 2021, we went from no patients recruited in urgent public health studies to over 1 million. And that, as a national showing, is truly astonishing. Now, the big study, which you would have heard about, and it was an early win for us, it was an early win for the whole world, was the recovery study, which gave us the result on dexamethasone, a very cheap, very easily available steroid costing £3 to £5 as early as the 16th of June 2020. But there have been future discoveries of the IL-6 inhibitors, tocilizumab, sarilumab, some of the monoclonal antibodies, and a recent one, baricitinib. All of these things have been proven now to reduce mortality. But more importantly, at the bottom of that slide are a whole list of things that others around the world said worked, and in actual fact, they didn't. And recovery was able to prove that they didn't work. And one that you might have been involved in fairly recently is the Panoramic Trial. Now, this is a trial to look at antiviral drugs, specific drugs that treat COVID-19. And Panoramic has been looking at, two licensed antiviral drugs. And you might say, well, hold on, if they're licensed, why do we need a study to see if they work? Because they're licensed. Well, the answer is, the studies were done in unvaccinated patients. But in the UK, we don't have an unvaccinated population. We have a highly vaccinated population. So there's a slightly different question for us, which is, what extra benefit do we get from the antiviral drugs when people have already been vaccinated 3 times, and in some cases 4 times? And the Panoramic Trial is going to give us that result very shortly. It's recruited over 26,000 patients since it opened at the beginning of this year, and that is absolutely unprecedented. So another lesson really is that our future success in how we respond to pandemic threats is going to depend upon having a very integrated research infrastructure and access to very large platform trials in the future. So finally, we get to February 2022, and perhaps some would argue that politically that signaled the end of the pandemic. Epidemiologically, I don't think the pandemic is over, although it is clearly much more manageable than it was, and restrictions were lifted in England. Our aim now is proportionality. how do we adjust to live with the virus in the long term, whilst all noting this slightly difficult problem of how much more variant unpredictability is left to go. But I do think we have to find a normality and a business as usual model for living with coronavirus at some point, and relatively soon. So that's really the end of the first part of this talk, and the major part of it, which was about the science and the lessons that I think we can reflect on. I want to say a little bit now about working in government. I'm not going to kiss and tell, anything like that, but I'm going to just tell you my observations. And the first thing is that working in government, you're working with politicians, and politicians have political instincts. That is part and parcel of why they're politicians. But I, at a personal level, have always found them intelligent and very committed to what they do. And although civil servants are very rarely seen in public, they are also incredibly intelligent, incredibly committed, and in my view, very unsung heroes. Now, one of the things that happens to people like me is that you get emails from the public and they say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And the answer to that is that advisors advise, ministers decide. And you have to keep that in your head at all times, that you're there as an advisor. You must always lay out the full facts and lay out the options and the decisions, but ministers decide, you don't decide. And you must always, because of the fact that you're empowering ministers to decide with the information you give them, you must always speak truth to power, no matter how hard or difficult that is. One of the best things you can do is stick to your guns and speak truth to power. Now, there of course there has been a lot of talk about not well prepared enough and so forth. I can say that this pandemic has been such a big health ecosystem shock that no amount of preparation would have reduced the fact that it was a shock. And there were no easy choices left for anybody after about 2 weeks into this crisis. And it's taken people a lot of courage to take some big strategic decisions early and to get that research and development started early and to take risks to find solutions. And it will simply take us several years to recover. On kind of leadership and decision making, I was once sent on a course years ago, which some of you will have been on, the Franklin Covey course, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the 7 habits is begin with the end in mind. And that is a really, really good principle that has come back to help me many, many times in the last 2.5 years. You have to be careful not to over-engineer the end, but stick to the principles of the end and what you want out of it. And another thing you learn quite quickly is that you must choose your battles carefully. There's a difference between a situation on which you have a view, a situation in which you think it is beneficial that your view prevails, that it's beneficial to win. And then there are some situations where it is critical to win, and they're the things that take you into the kind of resigning territory, I guess. And the other thing is that working in government as an advisor is a bit like driving a hybrid car. I'm sorry for the analogy, but if you look at the kind of the battery display on your hybrid car, the battery goes up and goes down and goes up and goes down like this. And that's what political capital is like within the government system. You can burn it up and you can recharge it, gain it back, but you have to think about your political capital. How much have you got at the time, and what will it cost you in terms of the use of your battery to win some situations and to lose some? And always, is it worth it? Do I need to save my ammunition for another day? And it's always good to have a fallback position, at least one fallback position, and to know where is the fallback position beyond which you will not fall back any further? And that's the point about never compromising on your own medical integrity and your ethics. And you have to learn to use communications very intelligently, very cautiously, but also sometimes very deliberately. And you need to document decisions extremely carefully and make sure the justification and the rationale are clearly laid out for the record. And you need to reflect often on what's happened and why it's happened. Remember that you can't ever defend a bad position for very long, so don't try. It's better to admit an error and fall back to a more defendable place. Avoid that disappointment. And although it's hard and there have been some very difficult moments, if you can just remember your humanity and try and be kind, then that actually goes a long way. And one of the things that I like to coach the students on, young people who are coming into this world, is in a high level meeting, just wait a bit, observe, control your breathing and just wait until you understand, you've got your bearings, you understand the point you make, and then look for the single aimed shot. Take the shot, but wait to take the shot. Make sure it is timed, it is clear, it is eloquent, it is focused, and it is very, very straight. And I'm finishing now. You expect me to say something about what's happened and how reluctantly, if you're in these positions, you do acquire something of a public profile, and you have to deal with the media. And lots of quotes about fame, but I like Bruce Dickinson's from AC/DC. He said, I don't like it at all. I would prefer to just do what I do and then beam myself up and beam myself down. In other words, when I'm not doing my job, keep out the limelight. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. But when you're dealing with the media, always be authentic. And remember that behind every difficult and sometimes snippy question from a journalist is a member of the public who just wants an answer that they can relate to, that they can understand, and they can do something with in their own lives. And that for me is really important, the kind of family test. What advice would I give to my family in this situation? If you can do that, then I think you're often giving the best advice you can. And just, you have to learn to be cautious in the public eye. And I have learned the hard way that even things like man works 16 hours and buys a curry before falling asleep can be a news story. And so that brings me to the end of my reflections on what has happened to us all in the last 2.5 years. I want to end by thanking you all for playing your part, for bearing with difficult decisions, for trying to understand what was done and why, and for some of you, I'm sure, helping with your local health service or your community, helping us get through this. And I want to thank the public for so many messages of support from so many people that have really kept me going at really difficult times. Vice Chancellor, I'm handing back to you now. Thank you.
So much for that. I think I can hear the applause around the country, and I'm sure it would be very, very loud if we were all together on campus. And I think also, I probably speak for all of us in saying we have to thank you and how glad we are that someone with your groundedness and humanity was up there speaking truth to power, and how very, very grateful we are for that. Now we've got lots and lots of questions, so and I have the power now of deciding which ones to choose. But I think just to start really with a question about, I suppose it's almost hindsight, but also now what you know. Is there anything you would have done differently? Is there any advice you would have given differently or changed in now that you look back on it?
Yes. Okay. So I think at the beginning, we didn't understand nearly enough about the potential of this virus to transmit from one person to another when somebody was infected but asymptomatic, or infected but pre-symptomatic. So in other words, those critical 12 hours before they even had a sore throat or a cough or a fever. And you know what it's like when you get, if you think to your last respiratory virus infection, it's very difficult. You can't say, well, it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when I became ill. You kind of go, well, it might have been 1 o'clock, but I was definitely feeling grotty by 6 o'clock. It was somewhere in that period. And that's the problem. You know, you can't kind of define this. And I think if we'd known more clearly that pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission were much more considerable, then I think the advice on face coverings would have been stronger earlier.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. But as we say, hindsight's a very interesting place to be, isn't it? But it is about learning as we go along. And as you said, we were learning very fast at the time. You spoke about, you know, speaking truth to power, just to go back onto that, and about having to deal with uncertainty, you know, scientific uncertainty when governments perhaps didn't want uncertainty, they want uncertainty. So there's a question about how willingness you found government to tolerate uncertainty. And then the flip side of that, and this again is in the chat line, is about how you balance certainty with the political imperatives of the day. You know, so either being uncertain or certain, how do you maneuver through those two kind of positions? Yeah.
What you have to do is just be very honest that you are uncertain. And it is difficult for politicians and ministers who like certainty. It makes a decision much easier. But you have to be very straight. You do have first principles to fall back on that are, you know, generally helpful. And you do have to understand that whilst you're giving the scientific and clinical advice, there are other considerations that a minister or a government might have to make in terms of a balanced decision that thinks about the economy, that thinks about trade, that thinks about international relations. All of these things, they're definitely the domain of government, but they're not the domain of a doctor. And so all you can do is you give your bit of advice, give it thoroughly, give it fairly, and then accept that that will go into a mixing bowl with everything else.
And often when you were doing that, you were working, as you said, with multidisciplinary teams, and presumably they all had their own positions on things as well. How did you tread that line as well, with those different perspectives being brought into the room?
Well, that was what SAGE was for. And SAGE, for example, had a whole behavioural group that was reporting in alongside the epidemiologists, the modelers, the virologists, etc., and the aerobiologists. So all of that was kind of brought together to blend a consensus scientific view. It's a very difficult job, and I think you know, that's why Sir Patrick Vallance is Sir Patrick Vallance, because he's very good at being the government chief scientific advisor and blending all that together. It's an incredibly difficult job.
And quite a lot of what you've spoken about is about behavioural matters as much as it is about scientific matters, although behaviourism is a science, of course. You know, thinking about the future, what have we learned about the behaviours of people, the behavioural science that could support us through any further pandemic that we face?
Yeah, so behavioural science was definitely a very prominent piece of advice within the SAGE infrastructure. And if you look in the minutes of the SAGE meetings and the minutes of the what's called the SPI-B, the behavioural group, you can see all of that. I think there will be lots of lessons about public behaviour that you will learn not from me today, but from the behavioural scientists as they unpick what has happened over the next few years with academic study. But the bit that interests me more is perhaps even out of the social sciences a bit more and into the kind of humanities. And, you know, I think there's a lot about communication and a lot about linguistics that has yet to come forwards and really be brought to bear in terms of the study of what we said and how we said it and how messages were communicated to the public. I'd love to see a lot of work in that area. I think that is really kind of ripe and fertile ground for academic study.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we do have some of that research in our own university at Bedfordshire in terms of behaviours, nudge theory and so on, about how you encourage particular behaviours.
Yes.
And the vaccine hesitancy that you spoke about would be part of that, wouldn't it? About how you, through the messaging, through the communicating, how you encourage that.
Yes. But we shouldn't overplay vaccine hesitancy in the sense that the UK has had a trivial problem with vaccine hesitancy compared to many countries around the world. And we really have a very highly vaccinated population. And I think a society that can see the benefits.
Indeed. And just on that topic, thinking about the geopolitical issues that you raised early on in your presentation, a number of questions in the chat line are about where we go with that, really. We're seeing things happening around the world now. You know, North Korea is in the headlines today again. How do we deal with that going forward? The rich countries versus those that can't afford the vaccine, and then those like Korea that didn't want the vaccine and just, turn their back on that as a strategy.
Yes. So there is always going to be, at a time of crisis, a role for governments to look after their own people. That is what a government is for. It is to look after its own people. But as public health people, we do know that until everyone is safe, none of us are safe. And there is a kind of global imperative to distribute vaccines around the world. It has been much, much better this time than it was with the swine flu pandemic vaccine in 2009. Much, much, much better. But it has not been perfect. And there is work to do there. And there is a really important role for the WHO in that arena.
I mean, clearly it's, once we've got through our own first stages, this now becomes a worldwide problem, doesn't it? And, one hopes that the UK can take a lead in some of that work and some of the experiences that we've had and the knowledge we've gained, that can be shared.
Yes.
How do you see that knowledge sharing happening? Is it just through the World Health Organization, or are there other ways that you see that happening?
I think what we need most of all is really agile vaccine platforms, and we need manufacturing infrastructure located in many, many countries around the world. And I think that's going to get easier now that we have the messenger RNA vaccines. I think they are remarkable and remarkably different. I think they're going to open up a whole load of targets for vaccines beyond infectious diseases and potentially some cancers in the future. And so I think we're just on the edge of a whole new chapter of what we can probably achieve with vaccines, particularly the messenger RNA technology.
Yeah. And of course, part of what we learnt in the pandemic was about the public understanding of science, and of course your own role in that has been absolutely outstanding. Where do we go with that now? We seem to have worked very, I'm moving away from behaviorism here, but more into interpretation and how people have come to understand so much better about their own health and about, you know, mental
Yes.
health as well as physical health, and to understand much more about how pandemics work. So what do you think we've learned in that respect that could be carried forward into other areas of scientific, you know, knowledge, things that people in their daily lives need to understand?
Yeah, so I definitely think that we have seen a public around the world, and especially in the UK, sensitized now to listening to, thinking about, and interpreting scientific data. And so I think that's changed the world forever in terms of our responsibility as scientists to present data in a way that's clear to the public. I think that's the biggest change. And I think there'll be, you know, this has set alight a kind of hunger for people to understand their own health and their own well-being in a much more meaningful way. And so, yeah, I think I agree with you that this is the kind of beginning of probably another journey again.
Which other scientific communities need to learn from and adapt into their own practices? It's not just about the medical scientific community, is it? It's about a whole range of expert people who
Yes,
can learn about how to engage the public, how to engage the communities in which they operate.
You're so right. You're so right about that. Yes. Yes.
I'm just trying to capture some of the other questions. There is a question about when you think the next pandemic is going to happen, which I guess is the, you know, is a $1 billion question, isn't it?
Yes. So pandemics are going to arise more often in the future than less often, because often they're from an animal origin, and humans are interacting with animals more and more on the planet as the whole ecosystem becomes more intense and more crowded. On the specific point about influenza, I still think an influenza pandemic is the most likely future pandemic, in spite of what's happened with coronavirus. And I don't think the chances of an influenza pandemic have materially increased or decreased since we last spoke in 2019. And I think the chances of a future influenza pandemic, we had 3 in the last century, we had 1 so far this century. I think the chances of those are independent of what has happened with the coronavirus recently. So yeah, I feel certain that there'll be more in the professional lifetime of some of the younger listeners tonight.
I'm sure that's cheered them all up no end. But thank you for an honest appraisal. There's an interesting question about the role of senior nurses as well as the role of senior medics in the whole kind of pandemic process, and you know, an interesting question about the absence of senior nurses necessarily in those early stages. And I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
I don't really, you know, beyond the fact that doctors and nurses do different things in the system, and there was always a chief medical officer's office within government. It was a statutory office. There has to be a chief medical officer. They don't have to be deputies, but there certainly has to be a chief medical officer by statute. But I agree with the observation that senior nurses were not as prominent in the briefings, but you know, I don't have an explanation for it, and I don't necessarily think anyone intended it that way.
No, indeed, I'm sure that's the case. These are not things that one plans at the outset, are they? They're just observations, I think, from us, you know, as viewers of all of this. Whose voices were we hearing? We were hearing very authoritative voices, but to be a bit more provocative, they did tend to be male at the outset as well. Not that I'm defining nursing as female in that sense, but I think that it's an interesting issue, isn't it, about how we were being spoken to, and I think, you know, one of the reasons that you're so recognised is that voice was such an inclusive voice, and that's an important aspect of how this communication.
Well, I think there were some very prominent women in the pandemic response. Dame Jenny Harris, Susan Hopkins,
yes,
you know, household names, absolutely. And people absolutely at the top of their game in medicine. So I think they were there. Yeah,
and certainly in the vaccine development, that was you know, a stupendous effort, wasn't it?
Yes, and you know, it was Kate Bingham, a venture capitalist, who led the vaccine task force, and the vaccine task force these days is led by Madeleine McTernan. You know, so I think there are lots of women involved in this, which I'm rather glad about.
Yes, indeed, aren't we all? But again, I think that demonstrates how we've brought so many different parts of the country together, different voices, different experiences. You know, in our own university, we've been involved in you know, developments to help Sikh men with beards have proper protective equipment. You know, so small things like that with big impact. You know, and I think the research arena, and I'm sure the recent, you know, REF, the Research Excellence Framework, those outcomes that have happened in the last couple of weeks, there must be an enormous mine of information there that we can get out about pandemic-related research that has gone on and has been submitted. And I hope somebody will be doing that mining and putting all that together, because certainly we put in case studies that were very much COVID-related, and I think that will, you know, no doubt be the case across the piece as well, including at Nottingham, I'm absolutely sure. There's a question about long COVID, and I wonder whether you've got any thoughts on where that's taking us, because we do read some quite extreme and rather frightening stories about that in the media.
There are some extreme and frightening stories about that in the media. Equally, I think it's true that there is going to be quite a long burden, a big burden of long COVID. I don't think we yet quite understand how bad or how long it's going to be, but I think it's a very real phenomenon indeed. There are probably multiple clinical syndromes that feature within the kind of grouping of long COVID, from, you know, a kind of post-viral fatigue, or including, should I say, post-viral fatigue is one thing. Another one is that, you know, there are long-term sequelae of being ventilated on the ICU for weeks at a time, months in some cases. So all of these things kind of figure into that. What the UK Health Security Agency are starting to unpick are data showing that long COVID is less likely and less severe in people who have been vaccinated and got COVID infection after vaccination. So I think there's potentially going to be some discoveries about the utility of vaccines in preventing long COVID, or at least reducing the likelihood of long COVID as well. And this is one of the, I guess, the frustrating things that, you know, it's, you know, always possible. And some people do take a view that, well, I'm young, I'm fit, and if I get COVID, I'm going to be fine quite quickly. But no one can predict who gets long COVID. And it isn't related to people who had very severe symptoms every time. There are people who've, you know, got quite marked long COVID symptoms after quite mild acute COVID infection. So it's a really troubling and difficult illness that we haven't got to the bottom of.
You spoke in your presentation about baseline testing, and I wonder if you could say any more about what that might look like, and is it purely an issue of economics and cost, or how might that look as we go through the next few years?
So it is undoubtedly an issue of economics and cost, in that providing never-ending bottomless lateral flow tests for 60 plus million people is a very, very expensive business. And for an organism that now, if you think about my slides, has a lethality that is more akin to flu than it was at the beginning, there is a question mark about proportionality of bottomless COVID tests when we don't have bottomless free of charge flu tests. So I think there is something there. But equally, I do not think any government around the world is wise if it abandons testing altogether and surveys, so that a new variant can emerge. We would find that it was spreading and not know about it. We would find that it was evading our vaccine defences and not know about it until it's too late. Because once these things get going, you can't get back ahead of them with things like a vaccine programme. You've missed the boat. You've really got to have enough surveillance there early to be able to monitor disease activity and pick up threats.
And is that happening now? What actually is the position now in this country?
Well, the epidemiological surveys are continuing, and surveillance of healthcare workers is continuing. So, I'm leaving that in the hands of the UK Health Security Agency to work out what is a correct level of monitoring.
Yes, I've done one of those myself, so I know what they are. But one does wonder whether that's sufficient in terms of the baseline that you're talking about.
Time will tell, I think.
Time will tell, and it is, of course, a political decision as much as a scientific one because of the cost. Could I just shift? We've just got a few more minutes, but just a quick question about care homes and whether there's any, thinking about how significant that was in our previous, in the last 2 years in our experiences, and what happened in care homes, and what we need to do in terms of changing policy about dealing with particular circumstance that happened. Do you think it was just a one-off thing? It was just a mistake that was made? Or are there practices that we've now really got to embed in our everyday thinking about how people in care homes are treated in the pandemic?
Yeah. So I think care homes were a really difficult epidemiological problem, in that you had a high concentration of older, vulnerable patients. On top of that, you have the need for them to have visitors as much as is possible. So in the early days, when visiting was allowed, there were people going in and out of care homes. And even if there are no visitors, staff have to go in and out as well to look after the residents. So it is a very, very complex epidemiological picture. Very difficult indeed to control spread in closed institutions or semi-closed institutions full of very vulnerable people. So I think, where there's an infection that's going to have a high burden in the elderly, then care homes are always going to be a difficult one and a difficult problem to solve.
Yes, and I'm sure so many people on this call will have their own experiences, to think about in respect of this. And it was really a very, very shocking thing for us to experience, wasn't it, at the time, that those decisions that were made about how they would be treated, and putting people who hadn't been tested into care homes was a very, very dangerous thing. But I'm sure that will be in the thinking at the moment. I'd like to finish just with some questions, a slightly more personal level, really, about your, was there a moment when you kind of had that air punch moment when you thought, yes, I've nailed that, they listened, or what was your biggest win, as it were?
A very big win was having conversations early with Sir Patrick, where he said to me, we've just got to get a vaccine for this. And I said to him, Patrick, we've just got to get a vaccine for this. And that was February 2020. We knew then that that's what we had to do. And so a big win was being really focused on that from the word go, almost the word go. It wasn't visible to the public at that time, but it was the thing that was already keeping me awake at night. And I'd already started discussions with vaccine manufacturers, informal calls, before there was a vaccine task force. It was that early. Now, the punch to the air moment was when I got the confidential readout on the Pfizer and then the AstraZeneca vaccine clinical trials, because I knew at that point, even though there wasn't a license at that point, but we'd just seen the phase 3 data. At that point, I knew there was a way out. I knew it wasn't instant. I knew it was going to take a bit of time and there'll be a lot more struggles. But I knew at that point we can get out of this. And that was an iconic moment, really. But it was actually not when Margaret Keenan got her first dose in early December in 2020. It was actually a few weeks before that. But of course, you can't say anything.
No, but a lovely warm glow for you to know that.
Yeah, and a little glass of something.
It reminds me.
Sure, there was a glass of something.
I hope there was. It reminds me of one of your little aphorisms about not winning the cup yet, but you know the goalkeeper can be beaten. I can't quite remember the gist of that, but it was
first penalty goes in.
Yeah, we're not there yet, but we know it can be done, and we know where the weaknesses are.
We have a way out.
Yes, and just finally, my final question is about life back at Nottingham. How are you enjoying your new life back in the academic world?
Well, it's a very challenging role. It's different because pro vice chancellors do different things to standard common or garden research professors, and I'm learning all of that. But it's important to keep on learning and to keep on being challenged as you go through your career. That's what makes it interesting. Yes, and I hope that you're seeing lots of students and enjoying working with them as well, and having the joy of working closely with students, which is what I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to the contact with the students. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're going to let you off the hook now from all those questions. I hope I've managed to capture the gist of lots of those questions, which were in some cases rather similar and so on, but we've covered a lot this evening. And Jonathan, I really want to thank you so very much. There are some lovely comments in the chat line anyway, thanking you when you're when you're obviously not feeling as well as you might, and it's just so good of you to have joined us this evening and given us your erudite understanding and taking us through things that we've all been through together, but we've lived through this. But it's really, really interesting and helpful to have this kind of gloss and to look at it through your eyes and to see why things were the way they were, why decisions were taken, and how this has impacted on our planning for the future. So it's been great to have you with us this evening, and thank you very, very much indeed. And I'm sure there will be those very noisy applause in the background there. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. We do have another one of these coming up.
with Lisa Wainwright. So that's part of our LGBTQ plus program in June. So I do hope people will have a look at our website and pick up that one and join us for that as well. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes who's put this on. It's been quite a challenge, but we've managed to do it, including me dropping out literally seconds before we started. So, you know, phew. Slight heart attack there, but we've done it. So thank you all very much indeed. Do keep in touch with the university. Look at our website for other events and activities that we're engaged in. Have a look at the research that we're doing. We're writing about that there as well, which is very important. So thank you all very much indeed. I would normally say have a safe journey home, but you probably don't have to go very far. But anyway, thank you all. Good evening.